Class, and I'm going to be moderating this morning for Journey Santa Fe. Our guest is going to be Richard Ellenberg, and we'll get to him after a little bit of the business. Thank you all very much for coming and spending this beautiful morning here with us to talk about progressive politics and party politics.
Announcements?
I will get to announcements. I'm going to start with next month's actually, I guess we could do announcements first because we're going to go right from next month's programs into this. So I guess that means you have an announcement, Marion?
I have an announcement. First of all, there's a program on solitary confinement. It's use and abuse. A free lecture Tuesday, 7 p.m. Unitarian Congregation. And also, you have an opportunity to sign up for the shelter, to work at the shelter. Some of you have done it before, and I will be here at the door. I have a red jacket, and if you're interested in either bringing food or working at the shelter in the middle of February, pick a day, and I'll see you later.
Okay. Melissa?
On the use and abuse program at the Unitarian Church, it's being held in Albuquerque, I think, at the Unitarian Church, but it's a wonderful program about people who have animals, and if they're in a relationship and the other person in the relationship hurts the animal in order to hurt the person. It's a very interesting series of programs, but it is in Albuquerque.
Thank you.
Yes, minimum wage, the effort to expand the minimum wage into the county is underway. There will be public hearings at the County Commission this Tuesday at 6. It's going to conflict with the State of the Union. And then February 11th, also Tuesday at 6, both in the Commission chambers. We've got good support with the counselors, but we need to show them they've got good support in the community by getting a good turnout and people speaking in favor of this.
Okay. Anyone else? Ethan?
Wednesday is a big day at the legislature. There's an immigrant rights rally to protect driver's license for immigrants. In the afternoon, I think it's at 12 noon. There's also Food and Farms Day on Wednesday, and groups organizing for youth homelessness, to prevent youth homelessness as well. And Thursday, New Energy Economy and firefighters are rallying for solar power of all the firehouses across the county at 2 p.m. I'm also running for City Council, in case you didn't know, District 2.
Okay. And Barbara's going to pass, it's not a hat, it's a basket for donations. And every month, Journey makes donations to various nonprofit organizations around the city and the state. So please give if you can, what you can. One other thing is I'd like to introduce Zuby Wilson. Zuby's coming on board with Journey to help do some moderating over the next 2 months. If you have ideas about different presenters you'd like to see, different topics you'd like to find presenters for, or have us find, please talk with Zuby or Melissa about any ideas you have. We try to make the schedule a couple months in advance, so please get your ideas into us one way or the other, via the website, via the phone, whatever works for you. And so speaking of that, upcoming events, I'm going to do in reverse order here. The last Sunday of the month, February 23rd, is going to be an overview of the Adaptive Ski Program with their director, Katja Franzen, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, which will have a slide presentation on that one. Sunday, February 16th, is going to be former New Mexico State Senator Dee Dee Feldman, who's just written a book called The New Mexico Legislature, Boots, Suits, and Citizens. And most of us are probably familiar with Senator Feldman. She was very good progressive in the Senate side for a number of years, at least a decade, I think. Now she's retired and written this book and remained active as a lobbyist, if you would, for some of the good issues. Saturday, February 9th, which is 2 weeks from today, is Diane Wood, who was the executive director of New Mexico Women's Foundation and has done a lot of progressive lobbying as well, and she'll be talking about legislative issues with Zuby. And next Sunday, we're going to have Houston Johansson here, and I'll be moderating that discussion on the city charter amendments. There's 9 amendments on the ballot for all you city voters who think you just have to vote for mayor and council. There's also 9 other issues that we'll be weighing in on and exploring and talking about the process for how those 9 got on the ballot and others didn't, as well as what the substance of the issues is. Houston was on the Charter Review Commission that came up with these proposed amendments, which now need to be approved by the voters. And with that, I'm going to introduce Richard Ellingberg, who is the chairman of the County Democratic Party. He's been chairman for 4 years. He is coming fresh off yesterday's county convention, which was a organized but chaotic event. And he's going to talk a little bit about that, and we're going to talk about the Democratic primary system and elections in general. But he would like to start by addressing some of the city charter amendment issues, and then we'll move into the others. And as usual, we will save time for questions at the end, so remember your questions as they come up. And when we're done with the presentation, we'll get to as many as we can and have a nice, fruitful discussion, hopefully. Richard?
Thank you, Rick. One of the charter amendments, number 9, provides for a full-time mayor. And I want to address this in the same framework I'm going to address the primaries and the Democratic primary process in terms of how structure and changes in structure affect governance. The city of Santa Fe, as I think you all probably know, has a city manager form of government. The theory of this is you have some really part-time city councilors and mayor. They get together every now and then, they set some policy, you hire a city manager, and the city manager runs the city. I've never seen that work. And the perception that I share is that we've had huge turnover at the city manager's position, which has resulted in huge inefficiencies in city government. And that results in the fact the city manager right now has 9 bosses, not 1. You know, if you call your city councilor and ask them to worry about a problem, they call somebody in the city to deal with it. The rule says, and the charter says, they're not supposed to contact anybody hired by the city except the city manager. Totally ignored. The city manager regularly is told, if you don't do things my way, I'll get 5 votes and we'll kick you out. And that has led to the rapid departure and burnout of some pretty good city managers, given how low we pay for the position. The 9, and I'm part of the PAC group for Vote Yes for 9, for a full-time mayor, makes a few wrinkles in that. As currently is the position, the mayor would recommend to the council, nominate to the council, the clerk, the city attorney, and the city manager. Council would have to approve. But after that, the mayor would become the supervisor of those 3 officials who would then officiate their staff. So the city manager would still be the one who hires, say, the director of Department of Buildings, not the mayor. The mayor would also have the right to fire the city manager, so you avoid the problem we had a couple of years ago where the city manager thought she had 4 votes and could ignore the mayor and take over the government. As long as she held 4 votes, she couldn't be fired. She didn't quite have 4 votes, but structurally, regardless of who thinks who of what, that's probably not a bad situation. We've had the last city manager fired somebody. He was a friend of a couple of councilors, and they kept trying to get him the 4 votes together to unseat him. That's just a bad structure. These are some minor tweaks in the structure. The city council could still fire the city manager with a supermajority vote, which only changes it from 5 to 6 votes. But that's a big change in terms of the dynamics of putting together the votes for firing a city manager. So the structural effort here is to put the mayor as a one boss with the city manager and hopefully start getting some stability in that position and some direction in that position. So, I mean, I strongly support that. All but one member of the Charter Commission supports that. But I leave it to you to decide. Some people think that makes the mayor too strong. Some people think it messes up the city manager structure of government we have, but I don't in my observation, we don't come close to working at that model where, in fact, the city manager is independently managing the government without interference all the time from everybody else. But this is a small structural change in the government that is intended to have a substantial effect on how the bureaucracy and management works. The city is pretty big now. It's hard to even get a handle on its full budget. It looks like it's about $355 million. But you had the city budget, then you had the utility commission budget, the utility department budget, the water department we purchased, then you had the Buckman diversion, then you have federal grants. When you finish those up, we're about $355 million and 1,500 employees. And people think that requires and is better served with a full-time mayor and more direct lines of authority in the city manager. Having talked about that structure, let me get closer to the topic at hand, which is the process of picking nominees in the Democratic Party. Not all that long ago, in the very good old days, I would have picked the nominees in Santa Fe County. You would have all known my name well. The same would have been true in the state, and the same would have been true throughout the country. That led to the primary movement, as it's called, the effort to allow all members of the party to have a say in who the nominees were. And then structurally, that has been implemented in a number of different ways. All of these methods we're going to talk about have one thing in common. Every registered Democrat is eligible to run and is eligible to participate in picking the nominee. And yet I think, as you'll see, the results are very different depending on how we do this. So we're going to have a pre-primary conference coming up in March. Every candidate for statewide office and federal office needs to get 20% of the vote of the delegates of that conference to get on the ballot for the primary election. And that's pretty significant. We've got 5 candidates for governor. I put a pretty solid bet we won't break 20% for each of them. 1 or 2 of them is not going to get on the ballot that way. You can get on the ballot by petitions, even if you don't get the 20%. It's not a big obstacle, but nobody's ever won that way. And it's a big deal. So Tom Udall got 20% plus a couple of votes when he ran for Congress. He won that. He's now our U.S. Senator. But nobody who's gotten 19.9% and had to get on by petitions has ever won. You're basically, if you don't have that level of organization, people write you off. So this is a big deal in choosing who our candidates are. Our delegates come from 2 sources. One are the state central committee members. They're chosen every 4 years. We have local elections, ward elections they're called. And wards are made up of the building block of precincts, which are created by the county. They are based on population, not voters. So the precinct with a prison in it has a pretty high population count. Not so many voters. But then we allocate to the wards representation based upon Democratic performance. A very different standard. We look at the number of votes that precinct cast for the last Democratic candidate for president and the last Democratic candidate for governor. And then we weigh the allocations on our wards and throughout the state on those results. So that decision-making on how to count greatly affects how many people the people in that precinct get to vote for as delegates. So 2 years ago at these conventions, at these ward meetings, very few people paying attention, even though we advertised them, they got in the paper, we sent them out on the emails. Participation, I mean, this is participatory democracy. You show up to participate. You can't vote if you don't show up. You have to take the time and effort to pay attention to where these are. Even though we do our best to let you know, it still takes some effort to find out. You got to show up and vote. We elect delegates there to the county governing body, and those delegates elect state central committee members. And those state central committee members are about 25% of this upcoming pre-primary. 75% of those members are being elected now throughout the state. We held our elections yesterday. So about 3 times as many as the state central committee members. We held our meetings at a central point, like you're supposed to. Again, they're organized by wards. The wards are allocated delegates based upon their past Democratic performance. People show up and they vote for their candidates. This gets a better turnout than the state central committee meeting, in part because all the candidates encourage their supporters to go to these meetings and elect delegates who will vote for them at the primary. How many of you were there and voted yesterday? Okay, and you're all pretty active. So the point I want to make is this is an absolute participatory democracy event. It was in the papers, we paid for ads, it was on all my emails, many of you are on my email list, but it is participatory democracy. If you don't participate, you don't count. And the threshold for participation is reasonably high. You need to know about the event, you need to get to the location in the morning, you need to register, you need to wait through your meeting, you need to drive here, and that can be a short or longer drive, and then you need to vote. Then we go to the pre-primary convention where all these delegates are elected and they're going to vote for whoever they want, and many of them are going to get on the ballot, which is a primary in June. At that primary, Democratic voters will select their nominees. That will have a much higher turnout. Again, the same people are eligible to participate. Everybody who's a registered Democrat. Because those locations are much more spread out, there's much more advertising about it, it takes much less effort to go in and just hit a ballot. Many more people obviously will participate. You know, if we had 500 people yesterday, you know, we may have 10,000 votes cast in the primary in June. Same process, different group participating, different results. We watched in the McCain nomination. He lost every convention there was, because conventions take more effort. The Tea Party is the most energized part of the Republican Party. They showed up the most. They didn't support him. In the primaries, particularly open primaries, and more than just Republicans could vote, he won them all. So I keep repeating the point, but I'm so impressed by it, I like to repeat it, that the structure, with this, essentially the same rules for participation, dramatically affects the result. Then we can go on to the open primary question from here. And the open primary question is, right now only Democrats can vote in the Democratic primary. In an open primary, non-Democrats, maybe just independents, maybe everybody could just show up and vote in the primary. That draws quite a negative reaction from hardcore Democrats. The reaction being, you know, this is we're electing a Democratic candidate, we're electing a Democratic standard bearer. God damn it, you gotta be a Democrat to pick them. The policy issue on the other side, from the party's perspective, is the broader the appeal of the candidate you nominate, the better your chances are of winning in November. So, I mean, we've clearly seen that. Republicans recently should have taken over the Senate a couple of times now. They elected people at conventions who weren't acceptable to the general public, and they lost races, frankly, with different candidates they could have won. It is interesting to remember here that under the Supreme Court case, this is a party question. It's not anybody else's question. This is a right of association of the party. The party has a right to determine it's open, or the party has a right to determine if it's closed. This came up in a Connecticut case where they were actually doing open primaries. The legislature passed something to make it a closed primary, went up to the Supreme Court, and the court said, no, This is a right of association of those who call themselves Democrats and associate. They get to choose who they associate with. So that these are all party questions. And then let's follow this one more step to California. California now has a system where everybody votes in the primary. The top two winners, regardless of party, are in the final election. And then you get into splinter issues. So you had one congressional district in California, lots of Democrats running, 2 Republicans running. Democrats get 60% of the vote. The 2 Republicans get the 2 most votes of anybody. And then you have an election in November between 2 Republicans. So my prediction as we move along this system with various levels of party and party zealots is the word that comes to mind, but party people who are really committed to the party down to lesser levels of commitment. If you go to the California system, what I would do if that was in my county is I would start a primary within the Democratic Party to see which Democrat we were going to support. It'd be back to the convention system, because I wouldn't want to be in the position of having 6 Democrats running and give the seat to Republicans. So that's, so you need to always play out if there are institutional responses to these things coming up. So briefly, that's the system. I hope you all, participate here, but participate in the system too. There's also the fear in the open primary of the party getting swamped by somebody trying to manipulate it. I haven't seen that happen much in the numbers we're talking about with a Democratic Party or Republican Party. But let's say if the Green Party managed to qualify again as a standard party with 5% of the vote, it wouldn't be hard to get 2 or 3% of the voters who are Democrats to go over to the Green Party primary and swamp those party members. So I want you to,
When that was the case about 10 years ago, there were 623 Greens that voted in the whole state in the Green Party primary. So, 1,000, 2,000 Democrats could easily have, and if we had our way and had none of the above on the ballot, then they could have all voted for no Green to run. But, so that's an angle that I have come into this conversation thinking about in the open versus closed primary, because I do, we had a show of hands of how many went to the Democratic convention. How many here wouldn't have been eligible to vote because you're not Democrats? So it's, okay, so half and half, and the other half of you Democrats will probably be voting in the primary. But, of the people who aren't Democrats now, would you vote in the Democratic primary or sit it out? Are your choices, or vote in the Republican primary for that matter. So that's sort of what we're looking at. And one of the points you made, Richard, I think is really, to me, one of the most startling, is if you do have the open primary, you are appealing to more voters and you have a better chance in November. I think that's, if not proven, at least I think most people that argue for an open primary within the Democratic Party are arguing on that grounds. And I believe you had a meeting last summer, a discussion about that very issue. So it's interesting that it's in the, at least it's on people's minds right now. And then when you were talking, I had a question about it's up to the party. I thought right now the state law says only Democrats can vote and only Republicans can vote. I know with the petitioning process, only Democrats can sign a Democratic candidate and only Republicans can sign a Republican candidate, and everyone else is left out until the third party and independent candidates might or might not appear. Is it not a state law? Does it say that it's up to the party to choose?
the state law does say that, but it's pretty clearly unconstitutional. The party can open it up on its own if it wanted to, and frankly, I'm in favor of, from the party's perspective, the strongest candidate to win in November. Parties are about elections that are immediately coming up and trying to win the seats. Parties are only somewhat about, you've got 2 different things happening in politics. One is winning the election that's in front of you, and the other is moving public opinion on an issue or a set of issues or overall perspective. One is advocating a longer-term point of view, and one is a shorter-term point of view, winning. I'm in favor of winning, and if you don't get the most liberal candidate you'd like or the most conservative candidate you'd like in the primary, That's because you haven't persuaded enough people that your point of view is correct. And I look upon those two, and I think they need to be understood as very different processes. Elections are about getting the best you can in the electorate you have, in my view, and persuasion is about moving the view of the electorate in your favor, so that next time they're more tilted in the direction you'd like them to be voting and more supportive of the candidates you'd most like to see winning.
Yes.
I had a few comments and then some questions as well. I didn't go to the ward elections yesterday because your email, I believe, said that you had to bring at least 2 friends with you who would vote for you to be that. Last time I went, it was people who were supporting a particular candidate would get together and they had so many people that they could then use as the voters, and you decided who would then, out of maybe 15 people, maybe 10, could do that, then that group decided who would go forward. That was one of the reasons I didn't even bother to go yesterday.
Well, let me comment on that, because that's the basis of participatory democracy. Everybody has one vote. The way this process worked is everybody had one vote for one person. Whoever was nominated, you didn't even have to be there to be nominated. Then the person with the most votes is elected, and the next most votes is elected, and so forth, till you fill the delegate slots, with a deck of cards available in case of a tie. So, I mean, that is the basis of participatory democracy. If they show up with a whole lot more people supporting their folks than you show up with, they win, and the 2 to 3 people is a reasonable guess of the number of people it took to elect a delegate at most of the elections. But I think that is the nature of the process.
Well, that was very off-putting, and I'm just pointing that out as somebody who likes to participate in democratic processes. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit too is the strong mayor. And I think it's a misperception to say that there's been a huge turnover or they're quaking in their boots every morning, like Robert Romero said recently in the beginning of December. I talked to Galen Bueller about that. He laughed. He said he was never worried about that at all. He just did his job, and if the council didn't like him, they voted him out, and if they liked his job, he kept it. And was his approach. And I have to say, as somebody who wants somebody to respond, and not only me, but many people have been stonewalled at City Hall to speak to anybody. I want my counselor to be able to go talk to the city manager or even a head of a department and say, this person has a problem, they say you're not responding, would you please look at it? Not trying to really pressure them too much, but bringing it to their attention. And then the third question, and so I'm not in favor of the strong mayor form of government because we already have supervision, and why have another layer of bureaucracy that gives one person a lot of power? I've been told it's going to make the whole system more transparent and responsible, and if you want to respond to that, Richard, I'd really appreciate that. But I'm disappointed they lumped everything together because I would like to have the mayor vote on everything, but I don't want another layer of bureaucracy that we're going to wind up paying him $150,000 or her, because this 74 is just before the committee meets to set the price, the wage, and if you pay that city manager $120,000, the supervisor of the city manager will definitely be paid more. Last question, excuse me, just one last question. So one is, the last question is, as a Democrat, as the party in a nonpartisan election, why is the party supporting Javier Gonzalez and not just being quiet about it when the other 2 candidates are Democrats too?
Well, let's start with the last one. The party's not supporting anybody. The party infrastructure, the party emails, myself, I cannot make endorsement. I mean, anybody else besides myself and the vice chair can make endorsements under the party rules, but the party is not supporting anybody. On the strong mayor part of it, I would say, first of all, it's not a strong mayor amendment, I don't think. It doesn't give the mayor veto power, it doesn't give the mayor anywhere near the powers that he has in Albuquerque. I would I just have a different perception of how city government has functioned and not functioned well. And I think, for the last 3 mayors, I think the average stay for city manager has been well under 2 years. And that's just not a good structural situation. That's my perception of it. And on the voting thing, I wanted to point out that the provision for the mayor voting on everything is a different charter amendment from this one that makes the mayor full-time. And I believe that's Amendment 8. And Amendment 9 is the one that would make him full-time, and starts with a salary of $73,000 with an independent commission, like they seem to have used pretty successfully in Albuquerque, would ultimately be setting the salary. I also want to point out that on this one Amendment 9, it's not effective for 4 years. So like all good structural changes, and you're not voting for it when you know whose ox is going to go. You don't know who's going to necessarily be the mayor running in 4 years for this, and that's always a good thing when you try and think about what's a better structure and not be influenced by who you think is going to be running this country.
Okay, do we have some more questions on the structure and process in the Democratic primary in particular?
I have a question.
Excellent.
So I'm wondering, in terms of the free association of the parties, is that give the parties the right to not hold primaries at all and choose a different form of election? I know we didn't have a primary for president a few years ago. Is that something that the party always can choose?
No, the system is set. We can choose who participates in the decision making. Since it goes on the ballot for the state elections, that is a process set, and it's also set, I believe, conventions for those who aren't getting on the state ballot. Those outside those procedures are set. It's just who participates in them would be done. And I think we've done a primary or a caucus. And one thing I was supposed to, and I forgot to mention, was the caucus process for president. Generally, in June, we had the primary and pick our candidate, our candidate or the electors to support our candidate for president. Richardson put in the caucus process to try and move up in time when New Mexico chose, so it would have more influence and candidates would spend more time here and spend more money here. The caucus process is then sort of like the primary, but sort of like the board process, in that in the county, the party would pick some voter locations. The polls would be open with using ballots like the county, we'd rent them from the county, they'd be exactly like the county used. And participation then is in between what we get from the two other events. It's not the level of dedication, participation that you need to make it to the county convention and ward meetings, but it's not as convenient as the precinct meetings. It's not as well advertised, and there are not as many locations. I hope we never do that again. And the reason is, as a party, we don't have the resources to do it successfully. Brian Colon raised $300,000. We had a huge amount of, each county was spending money, volunteers from the county last time, and it was still a pretty haphazard practice. Ran out of ballots here, this voting location didn't work here. The party doesn't have the resources to do what people expect to function like a primary in the caucus. So it only is going to give the party a black eye to try and do it, so I hope we don't see it again.
Well, with that said, I wonder what you think about this legislature moving the primary date more towards February or March to get that power, if you will, on the national level to attract more candidates and hear earlier. Because by June, almost every year the presidential nominee's been decided, and then it's just an exercise to go vote for president. I mean, there's other candidates on the ballot. Have you heard of any move to do that, or do you think it would be a good idea?
I've heard of it, but I'm always hearing it doesn't have the votes to do it. One of the issues with that is, for cost reasons, do you move all the primaries up earlier? And then are you choosing your county commission candidates in February, 9 months before the election, which forces your campaigns for the county commission seats and all the other county seats and local seats to start at least by September. And the state legislators and the county commissioners and all those folks don't want that to happen. You could split them. Some states do a presidential primary and then another primary, but then you're paying the money for a primary twice, and that's a significant amount of money. So I haven't heard of any strong movements to do that.
Okay, and it would probably be illegal to combine those elections with city elections, right? Because that's, most municipalities in New Mexico have city elections in March as well. Albuquerque being the one exception I can think of. So I think it's illegal to put those both on the ballot at the same time, is that right?
They are required to be different under the state law. Of course, state law would set the new times, and it could set them all at the same time. Again, these are result-oriented choices. The city elections won't draw nearly as many people to the polls as the primary will or the November election. The special school board elections for those seats draw only mostly people who are interested, particularly in the schools. The bond issues for school board draw a couple hundred people, mostly people interested in the schools. So when you look at these things, they are different times because you get different levels of participation. Different people turn out, different interest groups turn out, different numbers of people turn out. I can have long discussions as to what's good and bad in my opinion for these things, but you need to understand that all these different election times are deliberate and result-oriented.
I have a question. I don't know if maybe you can answer it or not, it might not be appropriate, but I'm just really interested in what different kinds of things are happening around the state. Somebody the other day said in Las Cruces, they're really trying to get trains going, and they're proposing some amendments for the legislature. And I said, oh, I didn't know that, to have better rail service in the southern part of the state. And I'm wondering if there are certain things like that that are happening that would be interesting for us to watch, even though we can't vote in those areas. Just what is being emphasized in different counties and in different areas in the state that might be something innovative and interesting for us to know about here?
We're in this, I can answer that on a number of different levels. We're in the short session and the state legislature, so not too much can come up because nothing happens besides budget issues unless the government calls for it. But the statewide minimum wage effort and the effort to increase funding for schools out of the permanent fund are two big things to watch, and you need to watch that one carefully because the amendment to add the statewide funding, Tim Trujillo's amendment of 5.8% to the schools is a pretty clean amendment, just increases the money out of the permanent fund to the schools. And the amendment to bring it to early education funding has also incorporates the effort of the Catholic Church and private groups to privatize education, and all that money would not run through the public school systems. So that's one reason that hasn't gotten too far, is because the education communities won't support that and the early education amendment because of all the privatization issues that one would enshrine. So, I mean, the games always get very complex. The other main issue I'd watch is water issues. I mean, we're in pretty sound shape with the Buckman diversion. We sort of have 3 sources of water supply. We're actually in, next to most communities in pretty good shape in terms of multiple supply sources. You can expect this year huge amounts of farmers not to be farming. Another dry year, those reservoirs are exhausted. I mean, almost all the money requests going to legislatures right now are water requests. Contaminated wells, because the water table's dropped and there's the contamination, not enough water, one source of water, and that's drying up, needing for big infrastructure improvements for another source of water. Part of the Ammon settlement stuff that's still going on is affected by the fact that a huge number of the wells up there are now contaminated by chemicals from farming. So I would, the issues that may not always be on the headlines, but they're going to be driving the most folks for a while, it's going to be water.
couple years back, voters in Santa Fe passed the instant runoff voting along with some other changes. Hasn't been implemented until now, so I'm wondering what's the reason for that, aside from what's been expressed by the mayors there, some like deep distaste by the Democratic Party machine, and fear that some different candidates might win in some runoff voting. And second question, to State Chairman Sam Bregman recently called out John Arthur Smith, Senator John Arthur Smith, for his lack of support for early childhood education, which we were just talking about, and saying he should stop being a Democrat and switch over to a Republican, and if not, he'll be primaried. You think that's a good move to pull out Democrats who vote like Republicans?
I'll have fun with those. The only reason I understand we don't have instant runoff yet is the affordable computer software and machines that could handle it. And there's a high expectation that by 2016 that will have changed. I argue from my positions, but I believe government is best from the middle. And instant runoffs will tend to give us candidates in the middle. Because they can attract the second round votes of folks, and you don't risk having someone getting 25% of the vote and being hated by 75% of the city. So I'm a believer in governing from the middle and advocating from your position. In terms of Mr. Bregman, I would have to ask him what he thought his objective he was after with that. John Arthur Smith is at the right side, at a particular side of the Big Ten of the Democratic Party. There are groups that pay attention to all these things and try and primary Democrats. They're not going to primary John Arthur Smith because, frankly, for that district, he's pretty good and going to win. So, I have to ask what the objective is. If the objective is to pass early childhood education, or one of the education amendments, I think that really hardened the votes, him and others who are opposed to it. And they're not, the grounds to oppose that are not frivolous. You would normally take 4% out of a trust fund as a rough rule fund, out of a permanent fund to take out of it, so that it will grow enough at least to keep up with inflation, so that 20 years from now have the same purchasing power. The permanent fund is only part of the trust fund. There's also all this land over here that's producing the oil revenues and stuff that's going into the permanent fund. So what you'd like to know is the value of that whole package. Not so easy to do. There are no appraisals of these millions of acres of land and subsurface rights scattered all over. And it would take a long time, and by the time you finish appraising them all and spending a fortune, the older appraisals would be out of date. If you look at just general cash flow, which I did Freedom of Information Act requests on this recently too. If you look at the cash flow and capitalize it at, say, 10%, which is probably a conservative figure, you begin to get a value of around $6 billion for that land. Bringing the value of the trust fund up now to, it's about 13.25 in the permanent fund. At $6 billion, you're at 19.5. 5.8% of the permanent fund would come to about 4.5% out of the total package. If you wanted to keep that down to 4%, you'd look at 5.5%, which is where we are now, but it's decreasing back to 5%. So I think you can have, and nobody's had, a discussion of increasing the outlay in a way that the fiscal conservatives would find satisfactory by looking at the overall value of this thing, and I think you can make a strong case for a 5.5, not a 5% payout. The other thing you need to learn, have to pay attention on education is, every other state taxes itself. We rely primarily on this bounty of the permanent fund. I mean, if we really want to get serious about education, we need to give the populace or the state, if we want to do it on equal formulas, we We need to start going to a property tax, a staple base, and increasing the funding that we give to education. You know, going from 5% to 5.8% is about $110 million a year for education, which is a lot. But it's not enough to begin to get us to the level Dr. Boyd says we need for salaries to attract and keep the quality people that we want to be our teachers. So if we're going to have a serious discussion about this, we're going to have to look at what it would cost to get there, what are the tax options we would need to execute to get there, and then are we willing to do that?
Actually, the gentleman behind Jan has his hand up too.
You're an old acquaintance, so this is a friendly question. But how did you get elected to be the chair?
He worked it.
And that's right, I worked it with some friends. For each ward, we identified people to go to those meetings, to elect people on the county central committee who would vote for me as chair. It was somewhat of a divisive election. I'm the first non-Hispanic in a century. Last time we had non-Hispanics, this was a Republican town. But I worked it with some friends. We really worked it hard, pushing people we knew to get to those meetings to vote for people who would then vote for me for chair.
I had a question about the affordable or living wage that's being pushed into the county. We have had virtually no job growth in the state. We're last in the nation. The city government says it's flat. They can't even figure out how to pay this $10 million, even though you say it's a $350 million budget they have. That $10 million, that's the shortfall from not having the state compensate us for not having taxes on food. That they can't even come up with that 3% growth that they need to make up for that deficit. Yet businesses are supposed to come up with 3% because that's about, sometimes it's 1%, sometimes it's more, but a cost of living increase for every year that the affordable wage is in place. And so my concern is, and my other concern, let me just say about this affordable wage, is that it's an entry-level wage. And it's not what a 40-year-old should be aspiring to who has 2 or 3 kids. So how do you give people an affordable wage and yet produce incentives or put incentives in the system so that people just don't say, well, it doesn't matter, I can just jump from this one job to another because I'm going to get $15 an hour ultimately when things keep going up, and I don't really have to know anything. And how do you, again, get people motivated to increase their skills? How do you motivate people to take a supervisor job when maybe their wages aren't going up because you have to pay the more entry-level people more and more every year?
Well, there are a number of things you said that I don't share. The city does have to come up with $750,000 now as the hold harmless is phased out, and over 15 years it is expected to be about $10 million. The Breaking Bad bill alone in the first quarter of this year generated $3 million in extra taxes for the city out of the movie actions. Now that's not going to be true in every city, but this city right now is doing much better out of that overall compromise than hurting. The city of Santa Fe is also, with its highest living wage, has had the best growth of any place in New Mexico. The studies tend to show that people with so-called living wages, and living wages to me a misnomer, work full-time 40 hours a week and the city's living wage are below the poverty line for a family of 4. So this is not quite what I think most people aspire to. But it is better than $7.50 an hour, which is the federal wage. The other thing that happens with living wage or people getting more money is these people spend almost all the money they receive. And they spend it fairly locally, and that circulates through the economy. And that helps all businesses. I've read the studies that say you lose jobs because somebody won't hire somebody else, an extra employee, because it's for more money. And I'm sure there's some cases where that's true. And I've read the studies that say these people hired these people specifically because there was more money being circulated for the living wage, because people were spending more. And I'm sure that's true. I tend to think from reading the studies that overall, having a upper, lower class, and a middle class, and people spending money is what we've built our economy on for the last century, and generally we benefit from from some collective action, government action, union action, guild action, whatever it is that we organize in this huge society where we lose a lot of individual power, making more money and spending more money. So I think the living wage overall helps businesses, but I'm not going to pretend I can absolutely prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt, one way or the other. But we do know Santa Fe's done better with it, and I think there's plenty of incentives to learn more. And what happens is, if you want good employees, you pay $2 over the minimum wage if you want the best employees, and then you aspire for that. And I think it's right, it's morally right, and I agree with Pope Francis on this one. If you work full-time, you ought to be able to support your family. So there's a moral argument, and I think I buy the fiscal argument that raising the minimum wage is good.
Other question?
I have a question. All we hear about are all the things that are wrong in our state. And I'm wondering if you could tell us some of the things that we're doing right, and who are the real innovators in the state right now. Who are some of the people that are really making a difference that we don't hear about as much as probably we should? Is there anything?
Let's see if I can avoid being stumped on that one. Looking at it as a state that needs to make collective decisions on large-scale issues, water, attracting businesses, education. I don't see it. I see a governor right now who isn't interested in governing. We argue about third grade retention or not. All the studies are absolutely conclusive. If you're not reading at the end of third grade, you're in trouble whether you're held back or put forward. Okay, let's get on to something serious. Let's get on to serious discussion as to how much money we need for education and we're willing to pay for it. Let's get on to serious adjudication of our water rights so we know what they are and can begin to manage them much more efficiently. Right now the state engineer is supposed to be managing this stuff, and we don't have adjudicated water rights, so he doesn't know what he's managing. I think, yeah, I'm sure we're doing some things. The trains are a good start. The solar energy stuff is good, but we're not putting in the infrastructure it would take to really export the type of electricity we could produce from solar and wind to other states. And until they develop better batteries, we don't have the storage capacity to just use it internally. You have to have good transportation systems to move it. I see us falling short right now in almost everything I can think of.
Don't we though, aren't we number one? Aren't we number one in the United States, Albuquerque and Santa Fe, for the cities that know how to conserve water the best?
Well, certainly Santa Fe is great in that.
Yeah.
And Santa Fe as a living environment is certainly number one in best place to retail shop, best place to visit, best place for tourists, best places to live. We have such a unique place here where you can walk in these mountains and come downtown and go to a good restaurant or a great theater or a great art gallery. We are blessed in this place. So, yes.
Do you have any feelings about the oil and Lamy controversy? Transporting the trucks, with the oil and moving them to the trains?
I do. There is a constant conflict between jobs and economic growth and risks that can entail. In this case, I think, right now, we don't have the standards in place to make those trucks reasonably safe and those rail cars reasonably safe. I mean, everything I'm reading with these train accidents is we're using cars that aren't up to current standards that would probably avoid a spill and a burn if they turn over. We're using trucks that also aren't in those standards. So I think as long as that's dangerous, you really don't want this occurring right next to the water supply for Lamy. So I think right now, in my opinion, it's probably too dangerous. The danger to the Lamy water supply doesn't justify the economic benefit of this.
Okay, and one more question. 'cause these
Before
are-
you do, I wanted to weigh in on some of the things we're doing right, because
Okay.
you mentioned water, and I remember the statistic, our average water consumption in Santa Fe has gone down about 25 or 30% in the last 15 years. That we were averaging over 150 gallons per household, and it's a little over 100 now. At least
It's the same, it did decrease from
So-
15 years ago to 10 years ago, but in the last 10 years, it's been the same.
Okay, so we made a big push 10 years ago and did real well on that. And then another thing is what Marielle, I'm sure, talked about last week, and Ethan brought up, getting these solar panels on firehouses, and if we can expand that to other public buildings, these are some good strides in the right direction. They're not huge. Again, it's not gonna get the headlines every day, but there are good things going towards conservation and things like that, especially in Santa Fe, but I'm sure in other places too.
One more, what
One
about?
more for Melissa, and
Yeah,
then,
sorry, but I've been thinking about questions to ask you. Hospitals, we have St. Vincent's, and it's been very problematic and controversial, and is any candidate addressing that and the possibility of supporting a new hospital in Santa Fe for a little bit of competition to sort of up the game there and have better health care for us in Santa Fe?
You hit a very personal issue. I'm a too frequent user of hospital services. And I'm about to have some more use of it. And up to now, I've done it all locally. Now when I talk to people, whether they're doctors who work for or not for the hospital, medical personnel work for or not for the hospital, individuals who work for or not for the hospital, the recommendation is unanimous. You would not do it here. They have ruined this hospital. They have cut the nursing staff levels. They've cut the experience. I mean, it's not a bad emergency room for a nearby emergency room. It's better than being in the middle of a rural county. But But to your question, I haven't heard any of the candidates addressing or doing much to address that issue. I mean, there are really two options. One is to try and encourage Presbyterian to come up here, and the other is to look at eminent domain, both of which are pretty big leaps for city government to look at, either helping to finance and find operators for a hospital, or figuring out how you're going to give legally enough incentives to Presbyterian to move up here.
As long as we're on the economic statistics locally, I'd like to throw one in here so that everyone should be aware of it. A couple of years ago, we did a study for the Old Santa Fe Association on how many jobs in Santa Fe depend on its not looking like San Diego. And it turned out that 15,000 jobs in the city depend on its continuing to attract people from elsewhere. And that's a number to keep in mind in all the conversations around here.
okay, do we have any other questions? We've got a little more time.
I just want to address the hospital issue. We're holding a District 2 and District 4 candidates forum in the conference room in the hospital on Monday, and the question came up about senior citizens and it was a question about youth and seniors, and in 2 minutes addressed what you will do for youth and seniors. So my answer for the seniors part was, we talked about municipalizing the energy grid. Well, here we're in the hospital, why don't we talk about municipalizing the hospital? And I know that would be very, very controversial, but we can't keep going bankrupt to take care of our health needs. It's just not sustainable.
Okay, thank you. Did you have any remarks to close with after hearing?